The man who delivered her called it a joke. Jacob stared at the scrawled words on the bill of sale, the paper feeling flimsy and obscene in his calloused hand. $1. For a woman. He looked from the note to the back of the wagon, where she huddled under a coarse blanket, her small frame trembling against the biting wind. Her dark hair was matted with dust, her face smudged, but her eyes were not what he expected. They were not broken or pleading. They were dark and deep and watchful, holding a spark of defiance that felt like a lit match in the dry tinder of his soul. His rival, Marcus Thorne, had orchestrated this. It was a final, cruel piece of theater designed to underscore Jacob's ruin. The failing ranch, the mounting debt, and now this, a human being delivered to his doorstep like a stray animal. His first instinct was a hot surge of rage and shame. Send her back. But back to what? He was a man drowning in his father's legacy, and Thorne had just handed him a stone. The sky had turned the color of old bruises, mirroring the ache inside him. He stalked to the wagon, his boots heavy in the dirt. He couldn't meet her gaze. He pointed a stiff finger toward the ramshackle bunkhouse. There, he growled, the single word a wall between them. He turned his back and walked away, the crumpled paper a tight, angry knot in his fist. He didn't want a slave. He wanted a miracle. He expected her to be gone by morning, swallowed by the vast, indifferent prairie. She wasn't. He found her by the well, dressed in a pair of his late father's work pants, cinched with rope, and a patched shirt that hung off her small shoulders. She had found a bucket and was systematically clearing the stagnant, leaf-choked water from the well cistern. For days, he ignored her, a silent ghost at the periphery of his vision. He expected her to give up, to waste away. Instead, she worked. She moved with an economy and purpose that was a quiet indictment of his own apathy. After clearing the well, she turned her attention to the tool shed. It was a place of rust and ruin, a graveyard of his father's ambitions. He watched from the porch, a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands, as she spent an entire day laying out the rusted tools, cleaning them with sand and oil, sharpening blades against a worn whetstone. His one remaining hand, a grizzled old-timer named Ben, grunted in grudging approval. She's got more industry than a beehive. Jacob didn't respond, but he felt the truth of the words. She was not waiting for him to save her. She was not waiting for anything. She was creating a world she could survive in, one sharpened hoe at a time. The sight of her, small and determined amidst his sprawling decay, was more unsettling than any of Thorne's taunts. The garden was her next project. It was a barren, sun-scorched rectangle of earth behind the house where his mother once grew roses. Now it was a monument to neglect, choked with weeds and cracked like old pottery. He watched as she attacked it with a ferocity that was almost frightening. She tore out the weeds, her hands, which he'd assumed were delicate, proving to be tough and tireless. She tilled the soil with one of the revitalized hoes, her back a straight, unyielding line against the oppressive sun. Then she began hauling buckets of the clean water she'd secured from the well, painstakingly soaking the thirsty ground. One afternoon, he found her in his father's dusty office, a place he rarely entered anymore. She had an old farmer's almanac open on the desk. She couldn't read the words, but she was studying the illustrations of planting cycles, her brow furrowed in intense concentration. She was learning the language of this new, harsh land through pictures and seasons. She was planting seeds of a future in soil he had long considered dead. He stood in the doorway, a silent, hulking shadow, and felt a profound sense of shame. While he had been nursing his grievances, this woman, sold as a joke, was cultivating hope. She was making the place better. The thought lodged in his brain, a sharp, uncomfortable splinter. Thorne wasn't the type to let a cruel joke fade away. He needed an ending. One moonless night, his men came for the last of Jacob's cattle. The frantic lowing of the animals ripped Jacob from a restless sleep. He grabbed his rifle, a grim, familiar despair settling in his gut. This was the final act of his failure. As he burst from the house, he saw her. She was standing by the barn, not cowering, but holding a lantern. For a moment he thought she was paralyzed by fear. Then she moved. With a sharp, piercing cry in her own language, she didn't run away, but directly toward the stampeding herd, swinging the lantern in a wide, hypnotic arc. The rustlers, expecting to drive the cattle out toward the open plains, were caught completely off guard. Her strange cries and the disorienting, dancing light confused the lead animals, turning the herd not toward escape, but back on itself, a chaotic, thundering mass of confusion. Thorne's men, their plan in tatters, fired a few useless shots into the darkness and fled. Jacob stood on his porch, his rifle hanging limp in his hand. He had been ready to meet their predictable violence with his own. She had met it with pure, brilliant strategy. He looked across the dark yard at the small figure holding the lantern, a single point of light that had just pushed back an overwhelming darkness. She hadn't just saved his property. She had saved him from his own predictable end. The cost of her bravery was a raging fever. In the chaos, she'd been knocked down, her arm sliced open on a piece of discarded machinery. By morning, the wound was infected, and she was delirious. He found her in the barn, her skin burning hot to the touch. He carried her into the main house, into his own room, a space she had never entered. For 3 days and nights, his world shrank to that sick room. He cleaned and bandaged her arm. He sat by her bedside, bathing her forehead with a cool cloth, trying to get her to drink water. In her fevered state, she spoke in her native tongue, the words soft and flowing, a stark contrast to the harshness of their lives. In the long hours of his vigil, he began to see her not as an object of his shame, but as a person. He noticed a small crescent-shaped scar above her left eyebrow. He saw the determined set of her jaw, even in unconsciousness. Tucked into a pocket of her makeshift trousers, he found a small, smooth river stone, worn from the touch of her hand. Guilt, cold and sharp, washed over him. He remembered the dismissal in his voice, the way he had refused to even look at her. "I'm sorry," he whispered into the quiet of the room. The words felt heavy, inadequate. He wasn't just apologizing for his cruelty, but for his blindness. He was apologizing to the memory of his father, for letting his own pride nearly destroy everything. When the fever finally broke, it was as if a storm had passed. Her eyes were clear again, weak but lucid. As she recovered, the silence between them changed. It was no longer a space of tension and misunderstanding, but one of quiet observation. He started teaching her words. "Water," he'd say, holding up a glass. "Water," she would repeat, her voice soft. Her first English words were the names of the things she had brought back to life: pump, garden, seed. A new routine formed. He would work on the fences while she tended the flourishing garden. They rarely spoke, but they worked in a comfortable, complementary rhythm. One evening, she was showing him a row of beans that had begun to sprout. She pointed at the tiny green shoots, a small, proud smile on her face. "Better," she said, one of the new words she had mastered. He felt an answering smile tug at his own lips, a foreign sensation. As she pointed again, her hand brushed against his. The touch was fleeting, accidental, but it sent a jolt through him that had nothing to do with surprise. It was warmth. It was connection. He saw her glance at him, her dark eyes holding a question. For the first time, he didn't look away. He realized she wasn't just mending his ranch. She was mending him. The trip to town was a necessity. The garden was producing more than they could eat, and they needed supplies. As they were unloading crates of vegetables at the general store, Marcus Thorne appeared, his shadow falling over them like a bad omen. His eyes, small and cruel, raked over the woman beside Jacob, a possessive sneer on his face. "Well, Jacob," Thorne drawled, his voice carrying across the dusty street. "I see you're still enjoying my little joke. Getting your dollar's worth, are you?" His men snickered. The old Jacob would have answered with his fists. The blind rage would have consumed him. But that Jacob was gone. He felt a cold, deliberate calm settle over him. His anger was not for the insult to his pride, but for the insult to her dignity. He turned slowly and faced Thorne, his gaze level and hard. "This woman saved my herd from your rustlers," Jacob said, his voice clear and steady, cutting through the murmurs of the onlookers. This woman's hands grew the food that will see my ranch through the winter. He took a step closer, his voice dropping slightly. She has more value in her little finger than you have in your entire black soul. The only joke here, Marcus, is you. Thorne's face turned a blotchy, furious red. The laughter died. The humiliation had been returned to its sender. Without another word, Jacob turned his back on him and helped his partner onto the wagon. The heavy ledger on his father's desk had always felt like a tombstone, chronicling a slow death in columns of red ink. Now, new pages were being filled. Small but steady profits from the sale of produce and eggs. A partnership had been forged in the soil and the silence, and it was bearing fruit. She had a keen eye for trade and a quiet strength that made merchants treat her with a respect that defied her origins. She was the heart of their new prosperity. One evening, Jacob sat at the desk, looking at the numbers that proved their survival, that proved his redemption was possible. She entered the room, as she often did, with a cup of tea for him. She placed it beside him and her eyes fell on the open ledger. In that moment, he understood. This wasn't his success to claim alone. It was theirs, built from her resilience and his reawakened hope. He took a deep breath, the decision solidifying in his chest. He pushed the heavy book across the desk toward her. It was a transfer of power, an act of ultimate trust. Her eyes widened as she looked from the ledger to his face. She was searching for something, and she must have found it. A soft light came into her eyes. Then she spoke, her voice quiet but clear, saying a word he had never heard her speak before. Jacob, it was his name. He froze. He had never told it to her. She must have learned it from Ben, or seen it on a piece of mail. But hearing it from her lips, spoken with such simple, direct dignity, was like hearing it for the first time. It was an acknowledgement. A true beginning. He found her by the creek that evening, as the sky turned a soft shade of rose. The sound of her saying his name echoed in his mind. It had stripped away the last of his defenses, leaving him open and raw. He stood beside her, watching the water flow. "My father," he began, the words coming out rough and uneven. "He was a giant in my eyes. When he died, this place became a monument to everything I wasn't. I hated it. I hated him for leaving me with a legacy I couldn't carry." He paused, swallowing hard. "I think I was letting it die because I was too proud to admit I needed help. I thought it was better to let it all burn than to fail him." The confession was laid bare between them, a shameful, wounded thing. She listened, her gaze fixed on the horizon. When he finished, she didn't speak. Instead, she turned and took his hand. Her grip was firm, her palm warm against his. It wasn't a gesture of pity. It was a gesture of understanding, of shared strength. He looked down at their joined hands, his large and scarred, her small and strong, and he knew he was no longer alone in his father's shadow. She had led him out into the sun. A year later, the ranch was alive. The windows of the house glowed, the fields were green, and the sound of healthy cattle drifted on the evening air. The place was not just surviving, it was thriving. Jacob and the woman who now stood as his equal, May, stood on the porch they had rebuilt together. The setting sun cast long shadows across the land they had healed. They had built a new language between them, a mix of his English and her quiet wisdom. They were partners in every way that mattered. "What's next?" he asked, his voice low, filled with a contentment he had once thought impossible. She looked out at the vast expanse of land, at the endless sky above. It was no longer a symbol of desolation, but of infinite possibility. A slow smile spread across her face, a smile that held all the resilience and triumph of their journey. She turned to him, her eyes reflecting the last light of day. "We make it better," she said. He smiled back, a true, deep smile that came from a place that was no longer broken. It wasn't a question or a command. It was a promise. The cruel joke had been the seed of an incredible harvest.